Welcome to another episode of The Grove. Thank you to our partners, Craze and Friends, Clean Tech Growth Lab for making this possible. But without them, it would not be possible to interview awesome people doing awesome things like Ben. Welcome.
Happy to be here. Great to be with you.
I held my excitement in the conversation before this interview, but I met Ben at a event at Greentown Labs, and I'm extremely excited to learn more about your perspective on climate tech, on building in the space, in the world, how things come to be, all of these things. And so, before we get into it, if you could give a brief introduction of yourself and what you're currently building.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. Thanks again for having me, Blake. My name is Ben Soltoff. I am entrepreneur and ecosystem builder in residence at the Martin Trust Center for MIT Entrepreneurship. The biggest thing I'm working on right now is a book, Disciplined Entrepreneurship for Climate and Energy Ventures. The book is written, it is released in November 25th. So it's ready, it's here, and we're working on getting it out to the world. The book is the first how-to guide in book form for how to start a venture in the climate and energy space. It's a really accessible, easy to use, step-by-step guide with illustrations and actionable templates that you can fill out. It's based on the existing disciplined entrepreneurship framework, which has been wildly successful and part of the source of several best-selling books. And it's also based on the really successful climate and energy ventures class at MIT, which has spun out over 60 ventures directly. Another 100 ventures have been started by alumni, and they've raised billions of dollars. So I've worked with some really amazing co-authors who've made all those other things happen. And my job as the lead author of the book was to take all of their insights and inputs and turn that into a framework and structure and useful set of steps.
Yeah, that's right. So that's what was so exciting about this episode. So, before we dive into the frameworks and how you got into it, have you always typically these questions are about people starting businesses and things, but because it's authoring a book is also one of the most difficult things someone could choose to do. So, have you always seen yourself as an author? Is this your first book?
This is my first book. So that is quite an exciting thing. And
Congrats.
it's always been in my mind that it would be really cool to write a book. I don't know if I've always seen that as a defining feature of my identity, but writing has been a through line in my life and career. It's something that I've always gravitated towards doing. I was an English minor in college. I did nonfiction creative writing. I liked finding outlets where I could tell stories, particularly true stories. And in my work now supporting climate tech companies, telling their stories has been something I've loved to integrate. So I was a freelance journalist for a while. I wrote for GreenBiz, which is now Trellis Group. I've written for Canary Media, TechCrunch, and a few other outlets. And so I've published a lot before, but never in book form. It's always been online articles, a few pieces in print here and there. So that writing skill has been something I've brought into my work. And when the opportunity came up to actually write a full-length book, that was really, really exciting. And it's been a lot of work, but knowing that that's something I've wanted for a long time and having this opportunity finally come up has been incredibly rewarding.
Have you always, a lot of the outlets that you have mentioned are in the sustainability, environmental space. Have you always gone in that direction with your work? Or was there at some point in your career where that became a focus for you?
Been a pretty heavy trend, a pretty constant thing that I've been in climate and sustainability. Certainly, I've been in climate and sustainability much longer than I've been in entrepreneurship. I studied ecology and environmental science in undergrad. Even before that, I have old footage of myself making nature documentaries in the Boston area, which is also where I grew up. And so, that sustainability has been a really core value for a long time. And I've worked on it from different angles. I've gone through the policy angle, I've come through the research angle, I've done actual forest research and measurement. I've come through advocacy and kind of informational outreach in the area, but most recently it's been around entrepreneurship and startups, either part of startups or supporting and coaching and advising people creating startups. So the sustainability has been something that I've been working on for a while, and I've now seen several waves and several different approaches of how to navigate issues in the sustainability space.
Yeah, so I'm glad that you alluded to it because it was one of my questions. Is that you seem to have a perspective that spans a lot of different areas where stakeholders in climate tech and clean tech exist. Like you said, policy. There's also research. There's advocacy. There's entrepreneurship. These things. So, for someone that has been active in all of these areas, and to a very high degree, what is your perspective on the role that each of these areas play in putting forward solutions to climate, or actually doing work that's impactful relative to building systems or economies or company solutions that have tangible impact on improving the planet? Whether it's like, is it some version of everything working together? Is it some version of these have certain places in certain industries where they're more impactful? Wherever you feel like you want to go with that.
I'm glad you asked that question because it's something that comes up in my work and life in various forms. And now I'm in the world of entrepreneurship, which is, very close and in the current era, somewhat married to the world of tech. And I think that there's a misrepresentation of folks in this world of entrepreneurship that they think everything can be solved with a startup and with a new venture. And I think that there are people in the world of tech who think that the answer to everything is tech. And I'm not going to say that's not a very real perspective, but it's certainly not the perspective of myself or the folks that I work with in the world of entrepreneurship. And this is speaking not just about climate right now, but I'm part of the Entrepreneurship Center at MIT. I work with other amazing entrepreneurs in residence and lecturers and people with entrepreneurial experience and people who are building the ecosystem. And I think everyone to a person in this world that I work in says entrepreneurship is just this wonderful way of building solutions. It can be an incredibly inspiring and empowering way of building solutions, but entrepreneurship is not the only route to building solutions. Certainly not for-profit startup ventures, fast scaling, potentially venture backable startup ventures. That is one route to impact, and I think a very valid route to impact, a very valid route to positive impact, and as we've seen sometimes in the last few years, even negative impact, and that's something we have to be mindful and cognizant of and work to avoid creating startups that are negative for the world rather than positive. But there's lots of other ways to create change. And I wouldn't say that those aren't entrepreneurship. In fact, in the book, we very explicitly say that climate and energy entrepreneurship is not just about startups. It's also about innovation within large companies and corporations, innovation within government, innovation within large institutions and nonprofits. This entrepreneurial approach, while we focus mainly on startups, the lessons can apply to any kind of innovation, and it's not just about creating startups. And then there's plenty of ways that people can innovate and build solutions that are completely outside of the world of new technology and startups. And I hope that anyone who's building solutions will find value in some of the frameworks we've put together. But I also want to make sure that folks are empowered and that we acknowledge and uplift the people who are doing great work in all aspects of this space. So getting back to your initial question, it is everybody. It is, a whole bunch of efforts. And, I think this is unique because climate isn't an industry. Sustainability isn't an industry. It's something that cuts across a lot of different industries. I think it's a very helpful framing because it's what draws a lot of people to the space and to particular solutions. But you can do good work in this space in just about any industry with just about any skill set. So you don't need to be starting a climate tech startup that is spinning out the latest, greatest technology from MIT to be creating solutions. And I would not want anyone's takeaway from the book or from my talking about the book to be that that's the only way to create impact.
Yeah, well, thank you for saying that because I'm on the same page, and I think it would be really useful, right before we again get into most of what you're alluding to with the book and things like that. If there are people listening that don't have aspirations necessarily for entrepreneurship or um, uh, be doing a startup. For example, I have a friend who thankfully agreed to do an episode, even though I had to go back and forth with her for a while because she is specifically a researcher. And she was like, I don't have a lot to contribute. And I said, yeah, there's so much for you to contribute to this conversation because research is such a huge piece of the space and moving things forward, but it's not as flashy and it doesn't move as quickly, and so like you're speaking to, it doesn't get as much of the spotlight. So if you could just briefly describe, I guess, or summarize for somebody that's listening, it's like what role does research play? Why is it important? What role does policy play? The advocacy that you spoke to, just how they relate in this system.
Yeah, I'll start with research. I've done research. I grew up around academic research. Both of my parents were academic researchers in cell biology. So the world of particularly academia was very present. And the whole pathway there of doing research, getting things published in journals, the learning and apprenticeship model that exists in this world of going from your undergrad maybe to a master's and then this long arduous PhD and maybe postdocs, and this whole process of learning how to do it before you're really driving the research. I'm very familiar with it, and it's quite a remarkable thing, really. I sometimes criticize folks in this world because they're too focused on just publishing research and not doing anything. Or not individuals necessarily, but the whole system is very much geared towards publishing research and sharing it. But there's no guarantee that anyone will actually use it. And when we have really urgent and critical problems in the world, that there can be a lack of urgency around research. But I will say, to the credit of the amazing folks in this world that I'm very close to, I think it's one of the amazing things in our society that we put out so much research for the sake of knowledge, that we have these large, sprawling universities, and one of their core functions is to create knowledge that benefits humanity and to pursue knowledge for its own sake. And in the US, there's been a lot more limitations and there's been just a lot more barriers for folks who are doing that kind of research. And I will say, like, it's so valuable that we have that. And even if we don't know immediately what the impact is, it's really important to have folks in this space who are expanding the limits of human knowledge. And I think we certainly need to support more of that and not less. And then on top of that, it's really pushing to think of, okay, well, now that we've expanded the knowledge, what do we do with it? And I think that that's the question that doesn't get asked enough. And I think, in fact, more folks would be in support of this research and would have more champions outside of academia if folks could see really directly what is this research doing for the world. It's sometimes very removed from the origins of research when it's used. If you think about vaccines and medications and treatments, by the time that you as an individual are interacting with those solutions, or in climate, I mean, it's at such a large systemic scale that you may never touch it directly at all. You may never even realize that you're benefiting from the storm that wasn't as strong as it could have been, the flood that didn't happen. It could very well save your life, but you don't even know exactly all of the factors that came from that, many of which started with research. So to get to that initial question of why is research important, so many of the solutions that I work with on a daily basis would not exist without research, without the whole apparatus of academic research. And it's not just academia. I mean, we've seen a larger cutback of research and development over decades within the private sector. And I think private sector research also has a huge amount to contribute, particularly in terms of research towards solutions. So research is a really critical piece of the puzzle.
Well, so also, and like you're saying, this aspect of taking research and then creating meaning out of it, creating impact. I mean, it's easy to see how the entrepreneurship startup tech perspective does this, but the policy regulation, is that another method of having this research have impact,
Yeah.
bring it and be tangible?
One of the big things that we focused on in this book that was different from other entrepreneurship books, even other books in the Disciplined Entrepreneurship series, is a focus on policy, because you simply can't create useful solutions in the climate and energy space without having some interaction with policy. And I think startups need to engage with policy probably more than they do, and there's a lot of value, not just for climate and energy startups, to doing this. But there is this idea of ask forgiveness rather than permission, especially in
Right.
Silicon Valley. You just put your ride shares on the road, you put your scooters on the sidewalks and hope people adopt them and that the city doesn't kick you out. And if they do, you ask forgiveness rather than permission. But in climate and energy, you can't create a new small modular nuclear reactor, hook it up to the grid, and then ask
Right.
forgiveness rather than permission. You need to work with the appropriate regulators and the appropriate powers that be to make these things work, and there simply is no route forward without doing it. So regulation and policy are essential considerations for startups, but your question is more broadly about the role of policy, and I think policy is absolutely essential. And I don't want to say that you can't create climate startups without a favorable policy environment, because I think that's one of the fallacies in this space, particularly now that we don't have a lot of super friendly
Mm,
policies towards climate in the United States at the federal level.
sure.
At the state and local level, many policies, and in fact, there are still some things at the federal level that are quite helpful to
Mm,
startups. So I don't want to say, if certain regulators or certain government officials are not in your camp, then you can't do it. There's certainly barriers there, but no one says, if there's change in the Department of Education, that education technology is irrelevant. It's the same here. Like, energy is something that we need, emissions are something that we need to deal with, and we're gonna have startups and solutions that work on those things, and that we need startups to work on those things, regardless of the environment. But the way I often frame in terms of policy is that policy can set the table quite nicely.
mm,
It can set the circumstances, and then it's up to entrepreneurs within startups, within companies, within any kind of institution, to come and eat at that table. And I think one of the frustrations I found working at the kind of purely policy level
mm,
is that even if you put the right incentives and the right systems in place, policy is not really good at that, nuts and bolts, rubber hits the road. And that's where we need entrepreneurs. And so it's
yeah.
not like, if there's policy, it's not, policy is favorable and things get solved. Policy is
Right.
not favorable, nothing gets solved. There's this, it's more of this constant interplay between government and startups and companies and all the different players. So it gets back to what we were talking about before. We need everyone, and
Right.
there's just a really critical role though for policy.
Oh, well, thank you for indulging my questions about that because, again, I think uh, having experience in all of them, I think breeds a really interesting perspective on how they work together, like you're saying. And so, just to kind of pivot a little bit, I'm curious, within, like, across all of those experiences and where you're at, how did it come to be that it was the right thing to do to write a book? How did that happen in your life personally?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a story of being in the right place in the right time, but also being the right person in the right place at the right time. I've been at MIT almost 4 years now. Most immediately, prior to that, I was in a role at Yale, so I have a lot of experience in my recent career working within universities, helping students build and launch climate solutions. And when I first came to MIT, the big project that I was working on was a collaboration between MIT, the Greentown Labs incubator that we've talked about, and a consortium of universities in Texas, because Greentown had just recently expanded to Texas when I started working with them. And they were looking to learn from MIT so that they could better connect and engage with these universities in Texas, when they opened their Houston version of Greentown Labs. So I spent a lot of time going down to Texas, engaging with the students and the faculty members and staff members and other stakeholders across the ecosystem. And working with Greentown and folks across that ecosystem, we built what's now its own nonprofit called TexEat, Texas Exchange for Energy and Climate Entrepreneurship. And so I was spending a lot of time going back and forth to Texas, starting what became its own nonprofit that now works with hundreds of students every year across Texas. A bunch of them were just at MIT at this amazing hackathon, and they had a huge role to play in meeting students from around the world and representing the Texas perspective, which tends to be a little more oil and gas friendly. But once that nonprofit got started and once there was a team running it, I had a little more time and capacity, and so that's why I bring that up. And I was thinking, okay, I got a little bit more free time than I normally have. What can I do? Let's write a book. Specifically that because I'd been teaching throughout all of this, both in Houston and also at a lot of different occasions in MIT, as teaching disciplined entrepreneurship. This framework was started by Bill Ollett, who's my boss, the managing director of the Martin Trust Center. It's based on his experience as a startup founder and teaching startups and entrepreneurs at MIT. It's the core of the oldest entrepreneurship class in the US, Entrepreneurship 101. Used to be called New Enterprises. It's been running for over 50 years, actually over 60 years, I believe, at this point. And so I've been teaching it and I've been translating it for climate and energy founders because that's my area. So I've been taking this 24-step framework and figuring out what applies, where do I emphasize, what do I maybe downplay or de-emphasize, what other things do I need to add around policy and finance and impact measurement. So I knew that framework really well. I knew the trials and tribulations of climate and energy founders really well. I had time. And then most critically, the publishers were very interested in a new book. So the 10th anniversary edition of Disciplined Entrepreneurship was just about to come out. A new book called Startup Tactics, written by the amazing Paul Cheek, who was our executive director and started this class on really the nuts and bolts of starting a business. That was about to come out. So they were on the verge of releasing these two new books, and the publishers were saying, what's next? And I said, well, I have time and I have this expertise. Let's do a vertical specific version of disciplined entrepreneurship because I think that's what's missing. How do we apply it? And that very much was in parallel to how we teach this stuff at MIT. And so we were quite fortunate to get a book contract very quickly. Publishing, you might not think of as a thriving industry these days. It certainly changed a lot. But publishers are interested in known brands and known quantities and things that have an established audience. It's a little bit like media these days where there's a lot of franchises. And, I think that is to the detriment of folks that are independent and that are creating something totally new. But there is something to be said for delivering something that the audience is familiar with and that has a built-in audience. And that was disciplined entrepreneurship. So I say all that because I was quite fortunate that we got a book contract very quickly because we were essentially the Marvel movies of books and entrepreneurship books.
Well,
And
well
so,
done. Well done.
and so we were able to get this, and I take very little credit for that opportunity.
Sure,
I
sure.
think being the right person and having the right knowledge, having the writing ability, and having the time and capacity and will to write a book were all factors.
Yeah.
But we were also in the right place at the right time, and that we had this existing series and a publisher who was interested in expanding it.
So then what I think that's really cool what you were saying, taking this existing framework that has proven to very positively impact a lot of entrepreneurs' lives and make it vertical specific into the climate tech space. And so generally speaking, what are the core differences between an entrepreneur, a startup in the climate space versus one that's not?
Mm-hmm. A lot of entrepreneurs in the climate space are doing what you might call deep tech or tough tech. They're starting things that have complex technology, quite possibly coming out of a lab at a place like MIT, though not necessarily. And it has a long timeline in order to get to scale. Often you're going from something that starts under a fume hood within a lab and goes all the way to massive infrastructure scale. And so you need to scale up a novel physical process upwards of, 1,000 times and that's quite complicated, and it takes a long time, and it takes a lot of money to do that. There are certainly opportunities for software solutions, for B2B SaaS, for consumer software in this space. So I don't want to say that everything in climate tech is all deep tech and tough tech, but we do need tough tech solutions in energy, and we do need it in climate, and we need, and I do see a higher proportion of things that are in climate and energy that are deep tech and tough tech. So that's a big factor in this space, and that's the perspective from which we wrote the book. So there's the long timelines, the high capital needs. We call that the high price of poker. Like if you're going to play a startup at think about it like a poker game. There's a certain ante, and the ante is high because of the high capital needs, the long timelines for climate stuff, for a lot of climate stuff, for a lot of more general software stuff. The ante is low and getting lower. Doesn't make it easy. It's still not an easy journey for any startup founder, and I don't want to say that it is.
Yeah.
But the AI tools that we have to expand that are lower. And then the ante gets higher each round because you're building something at a larger physical scale. You need more capital. And so you need to deal with that high price of poker. You need to consider policy. We talked about policy, and you cannot get around government and regulation in this space. You need to consider complex capital stacks to overcome those higher antes. Also thought of like as a valley of death where a lot of ventures don't survive. You need to go from usually grant funding, non-dilutive capital, to some kind of patient venture capital, maybe angel investors, maybe long-term capital providers, maybe climate-specific venture capital, and then eventually you may need to get to infrastructure financing, things like project financing and debt. And the questions that those investors ask, the things they need to see are very different. And so you can't just go to Silicon Valley VCs usually to get all the capital that you need. You need to piece together these different capital sources and keep the venture going across those different capital needs. And I just want to go back then to this point about scale. You need to be able to scale things. You need to be able to scale complex physical processes. All of that needs to work. And that creates unique challenges. And so those are some of the difference. Oh, and the one I forgot, planetary impact measurement. If you're doing this work, you're probably doing it because you want to have some kind of positive impact on the planet, and you're probably attracting people who are looking for that. And you need to be rigorous in how you show that to them. And usually the what I call the climate value proposition, how you measure value for the climate and the planet, is different than your customer value proposition. You're probably going to try to bring in customers because of factors like cost and reliability, maybe quality. Very rare to get customers because of climate value alone, but there are a lot of stakeholders who care about the climate value. And so you need to do that whole measurement. So there's this whole set of metrics you need to have in addition to your normal startup metrics about planetary impact measurement. That's another factor. So all these things are different in this space. The core fundamentals, I think, remain the same. You need to know your customer. You need to start somewhere that's small and reasonable and gives you a good foothold, a beachhead market, and find the right stepping stones to move on from there. You need to talk to your customer and understand your perspective. You need to create a reasonable plan that you can share with investors and other stakeholders. Like any startup needs to do all those things, but then this additional stuff around the long timelines and the high capital needs and the complex capital stack, the planetary impact, building at large scale, going through government and regulation, those create additional layers on top of those fundamentals.
Are there or is there a common quality or any common thread that you see between both founders that go after building in this space and are successful, and also ones that are not?
I think, well, I'll start by saying one of our core beliefs and principles at the Martin Trust Center at MIT is that anyone can be an entrepreneur. And we very much fight against this myth that you're either born an entrepreneur or you're not. We see entrepreneurship as a craft. It's something that can be learned and can be taught, and our job is to teach it. And so I very much don't want to give the impression that you can't be an entrepreneur if you don't have certain qualities, or that an entrepreneur only looks one way. And the people often have a vision or a picture in their head of what an entrepreneur looks like, and that's exclusive to many groups of people. And so there are, however, qualities that I think are useful. A top one would be grit, and then that's for any entrepreneur. I know there's recent research around what does grit actually mean, but it's this idea of tackling something, trying and not giving up when it's hard and when the going gets tough. That's part of it. But it's not. It's also not just kind of pushing the boulder up the hill again and again and again and having it keep coming down. Like there is a point where you need to know when to quit, or when you need to quit a certain tack and try a different tack. So there's also a working smarter, not harder, but you have to work smart and work hard in this space. And I think anyone can do that. And one thing I'll say about personality and climate entrepreneurs, energy entrepreneurs, is that this is a space that really rewards nerdiness, especially with deep tech and tough tech. It's a lot of folks coming out of labs. It's a lot of folks building challenging technologies, or folks working with folks who are building or researching challenging technologies, complicated things. It's a place where folks don't shy away from really narrow understanding the very particular fields of using a lot of technical jargon when they need to. You have to then translate that for a broader audience. But that all goes to say there's a lot of nerds in this space, and I think that's a really great thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can be that nerdy researcher, and you can lead a startup.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, your customers are going to really value how well you understand the technology. You still do need to be able to communicate to a broad audience. You need to communicate across multiple audiences, but you don't necessarily need to be the super charismatic tech founder
Yeah.
who gets up on a stage and presents this vision. If you can create an appeal with an audience who's got a very narrow problem in a really unsexy industrial area, that's actually where we need a lot of climate solutions. And so if you can communicate to those folks on the factory floor, those folks in R&D departments of major corporations, those folks who are building and figuring out really knotty, difficult problems, I think you can go really far as a startup founder. And I see a lot of folks who do quite well in this space who you wouldn't look at them and say this is a startup founder. They
Yeah.
don't have that kind of stereotypical charisma, but I think what they do have in terms of how they describe tricky technical problems and work through them is even more valuable.
So, a couple last questions for you, and two of them are my favorite.
Okay.
But my first one is with this project being completed, with it being at the stage with the book and the release and everything. Uh, is there a way? Are there any particular ways that you hope people utilize this book, specifically?
Yeah, I love that question. We are going to have a digital version. There will probably be an audiobook, and people consume media in all kinds of different ways there and right now, and it's usually digital. And one thing I will say is this is a book that's particularly useful to have a physical copy, because it's a great reference text. And I think that's very much how it's designed. You can certainly sit through it in one read, take it to the beach, take it to the park, take it to wherever. I've certainly taken the other disciplined entrepreneurship books to the beach and read them there, and maybe I looked weird, but that I find fun. But it's not meant like as a quick beach or airport read. It is accessible. It's not too long, but it's meant to be something that you keep on your desk, something that you keep on your table. And when you encounter a problem, you go back to it. And what was that one story in there? What was that one step that could be really useful? And so you take out the book. I have the physical copy here, so for anyone who's
Yeah.
watching, you can see it. And take out that physical copy and flip to the right page. And so a reference book is the key word there, something to keep around. And if you do have the opportunity to get a physical copy of the book, that would be my strong recommendation for how to get it, just so you can use it more easily as a reference.
Awesome. And so, releasing a book, writing a book, I don't think is very different from, launching a product, starting a product. So I think there's a lot of similarities there. And one of my favorite things to ask is, at the moment, what is one of the biggest hurdles that you're facing at the moment, and how is it also an opportunity?
One of the biggest hurdles, it's a physical product, a book, and so the logistics of getting books to where they need to be
Hmm.
is something that I wasn't necessarily expecting to deal with. There's been a lot as an author, especially in today's publishing environment, a lot falls to the author. You're not just writing the book, you're coordinating and project managing the entire process. You're out there selling it, engaging with your customers, your readers, your folks, you know, creating content to be. I'm here on this podcast.
Right.
It's a whole process, and you're involved with a lot of it. And one of the pieces has just been, I've been the point person for not individual sales, but for larger group sales, for getting books at events. And so just the logistics of making sure that we get all of the copies of this book into the hands of people where they're needed has been a challenge. And, it's not the sort of thing that you can just put on an app store or you can send out by email. Once you're dealing with the physical book, which I just said was the way to go, then you have to ship physical books, and they're not huge. You can see it's kind of thin, but any quantity gets heavy real fast, and
Yeah.
so those logistics. Been still figuring out exactly how to navigate and how do we get tables with this book at events where people might want to buy it. We were just at this great event at Kresge Auditorium and MIT this past weekend, and people loved it. But it was no small feat to make sure we had those books available.
Yeah. Well, good. Well, with all of this work to be done, and all of this work that has been done, uh, I'm curious what inspires you.
Oh, it's the entrepreneurs. That's an easy one. There's a lot that's entrepreneurial about writing a book, but the folks who are starting companies in this space, it takes years. It takes a lot of effort. It's often thankless. They often don't get the glory and attention, but they deserve it. And just seeing folks who commit their time and energy and lives to building solutions in this space. I've worked with many of them across great universities and outside. The work that they do is what inspires me, and their ability to keep showing up, to keep doing difficult, sometimes seemingly impossible things. That's what inspires me.
Nice. Well, me too. So I'm glad that you said that answer, because we share that. But thank you so much for coming on and sharing your perspective. If anyone else was inspired to follow along with your journey, access the book, which I think is something that I'm going to do very quickly. How would they do that?
Yeah, the book is called Disciplined Entrepreneurship for Climate and Energy Ventures. The website is DE for CEV.com. DE for Disciplined Entrepreneurship. 4 is the number 4, and then CEV, Climate and Energy Ventures. So just those 6 characters.com. You can buy the book, but you can also learn about the steps, explore them, access some of our digital resources. There's a lot of great stuff available on that website.
Awesome. Ben, thank you so much for what you're doing and for your time today. I'm excited to keep in touch.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me, Blake. I appreciate the invitation, the enthusiasm, and the great, really thoughtful questions.
You got it. I'm excited to see where you guys go.
All right.
All right.
Thanks so much.